Hello and welcome back to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and today I'm very excited to share a conversation I recently had with Father Shenan Boquet on the important role of grandparents and the elderly in today's society. As you may or may not know, the Church celebrated this past Sunday the World Day for Grandparents and the Elderly, which Pope Francis first established in 2021. On today's episode, Father Boquet explains what need Pope Francis saw in today's world, which prompted him to establish this day, and why Pope Leo referred to a revolution of gratitude when talking about this topic. We also discuss the important role of intergenerational relationships and how having a very mobile society is breaking down family bonds, which is in turn breaking down the relationships between the younger and the older generations. As always, if you're listening on our audio platforms, please leave us a 5-star review and subscribe. It's a simple, free way to help us reach new audiences. And without further ado, please welcome Father Shenan Boquet back to Living a Culture of Life. Welcome back to the podcast, Father.
Oh, Colleen, always a blessing, and especially coming back from the mission field. It's always a joy to be back in the studio to spend some time with you on some of the topics.
It's always great to catch you between trips. You know, we got to film 2 or 3 at one time just so we can get it in there between all your mission trips.
All the rest of the staff, trying to get a little piece of me as they can, because it is true. I mean, I am in the office, for periods of time, but then sometimes literally it's just kind of come in, change suitcases, and right back out the door again.
Well, when I took over the podcast too, like 3 years ago, it was like we were still kind of in the slow period after COVID, so you weren't traveling as much.
Exactly.
So I got very used to having you here.
Exactly. So now it's you got to catch a hook and pull to get that schedule, but it's working. It's working.
Yeah, it is. And you've had some great trips that we're going to have to hear about at some point.
Look forward to talking about it.
First of all, for today, I wanted to talk about the role of grandparents and elderly, because this past Sunday, when this comes out, is going to be the World Day of Grandparents and the Elderly, which Pope Francis established a few years ago. And before we just dive into that topic, Father, do you mind sharing some of your favorite stories of your grandparents? Like, what kind of relationship did you have with them?
Well, I was very fortunate to have in a sense, have a life with my grandparents, even some of my great grandparents.
Wow.
So, many of my grandparents and my great grandparents lived very long lives. So I have a memory of them, in particularly more of my grandparents on both my mother and father's side. My dad's mom died when I was about 10 years old. And so, but my dad's dad lived to be 97. So had a great blessing of being with him until recent. And then on my mother's side, both my grandfather and grandmother lived quite long lives. My grandmother would be a more recent. She lived to be 93, almost 94, if I remember the math correctly. So, but great memories, because they were very much a part of our lives. And, unlike today, where people are so mobile and Sundays are not what I was raised like. And there's most major stores, the malls were all closed. So the blue laws, particularly that most people would know them by. But so Sundays were really spent at one grandparent's home, whether for lunch, and the other one maybe in the afternoon or even for dinner time, with Mass, Sunday, a Mass always in between, usually early morning. So Sundays were really family days, and it really revolved around our grandparents and around being with our first cousins and aunts and uncles. So I have some great memories, and both sides were very much not only active in their faith, participating in their faith, but also witness the importance of the faith. And that's the rich environment I was very fortunate, blessed to be raised in.
Yeah, and it's something that's just so rare these days, as people, like you said, are so mobile. Like even like everything else that goes in the modern age aside, like just the fact that people are so mobile, they live far away. Like it was, when I was growing up, it was about 5 hours to one grandparent's house and like 2 to the other one. So we would still go over to the one that was 2 hours away on Sunday and spend the afternoon over there. And I have some very happy memories doing that, but it was just a little bit more challenging. You had to make a little bit more plan to be able to do that.
Sure. Well, one set of grandparents literally lived next door.
Oh, wow.
I just walked across the little bridge and I was there. And my mother's parents lived, remember, I'm from South Louisiana, so bayous. So Bayou Terrebonne separated both sides. So my dad was raised on one side, my mother was raised on the other side. And so my mother's parents, were maybe a 5-minute car ride. I can walk across water, I'd have been much closer. But it was just, they were very much a part of our lives.
Yeah.
And it was also understood, Colleen, that you were expected to visit them on Sunday. And it's not that you got fussed. Maybe they did. My parents might have got fussed. Why didn't you come over today? But, it was understood
Mm-hmm.
that this was a day for God. It was a day of rest, and it was a day for family.
Yeah.
And we lived that. That's what we lived. And I'm very grateful for it
Mm-hmm.
because it not only left memories, but it also, left their own, I would say their indelible marks. I remember my grandparents with great fondness. Even my grandmother who died, when I was about 10,
Mm-hmm.
was very much a part. I mean, she lived right across that little ditch, or across that little bridge.
Yeah.
And I was there every day.
Yeah.
And so they were very much a part of my memory and still remain part of my memory.
Well, I've heard you mention them on the show before, so I definitely wanted to just start with that because I think it's just so important to be able to bring that personal aspect of like what your relationship with your grandparents are. And also for people who didn't get get to experience that, it's kind of good to hear what an ideal situation would be like.
Right.
I mean, I think having your grandparents right next door is probably the most ideal you could get
Sure.
in that sense.
And the great-grandparents, so my great-grandfather lived till I was in my teenage years, or I would say maybe right before I was a teenager. So she died not long before my grandmother or right after my grandmother died. That I can't remember perfectly, but he was literally a half a mile from us. So I would pedal my bicycle to his house because he had ice cream sandwiches.
Yeah.
And so I remember him vividly. And I remember on the other side, Mama Baskell and Mama Falgu, and so I remember them, and more of my mother's grandmother from her dad's side, because they took care of her until she died. And so, and even like I mentioned my godmother many times before. So our aunts and our uncles richly were part of our lives. And I have one great aunt left. She's, I remember, she's on my Papa Van's side, Roger's side. So that would have been my dad's mother's brother's wife.
Wow.
So through marriage.
Yeah.
So, but she's the last of the great aunts. I have all of them now have passed, and many of them lived into their 90s. And some over 100.
And they all lived in the same area.
All lived in the same community.
That's so foreign in today's like mobile world. Like I know that some people still get to experience that, but it's just something that you don't hear of quite as often, and it's something really beautiful about that.
Exactly, and today the challenges really are not only because of the mobility of people, but also just because of the secular values that have crept in, and the unintentional sometimes consequences that happen because people move far away and they become disconnected, and all with the best of intention, but reality becomes the separation.
Well, and it's a whole other topic too, but when you have like children of divorce, and then like you have like instead of like 2 sets of grandparents, you have your 4 sets of grandparents, and it starts multiplying that way. It kind of fractures that kind of unity that it seems that you're describing.
Exactly. So it's and also just part of it is just the realities of today's climate and culture that we're dealing with. By climate, I mean culture, is what's happened within the society, what's going on in people's lives. And so it's important, as I know we're going to talk about, is to kind of put a pause and ask ourselves, is this really good? What we're seeing today, and how do we recognize the consequences of what's happening in today's culture, and what can we do to remind us of the importance of those in our lives, that our grandparents, our elderly aunts and uncles, or just the elderly in general. It's so important, and I know we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about that.
I was going to say that's a good transition to my next one, which was that Pope Francis established the World Day of Grandparents and the Elderly a few years ago. I think this is the 5th year this year. So do you mind like just describing like why he established that and like what need he saw that day is supposed to address?
What I always appreciate about Pope Francis and how he gives us this wonderful way of remembrance. Himself an older man. So he's looking at it also from the perspective of a man who's reached an age where in most of the culture today would be perceived as, it's time for you to move on, what can you contribute, and you reached an age where your contributions are less and less. And so he wanted to counteract that mentality and recognize the beauty not only of what our older brothers and sisters bring to us within our family structures, grandparents and great aunts and great uncles and uncles in general, and aunts in general, but also the general population. How do we approach, what's our mindset toward our brothers and sisters who reach a particular age? And he didn't mention age number. just the idea. But we all know that in the culture, it's each country kind of approaches its elderly. As a matter of fact, in Africa, many countries in Africa, I'm 59 years old. I'm considered an elder now. So it comes with some perks. But I was probably thinking most people are thinking people their late 70s, 80s, and so the Holy Father is kind of stepping back and reminding us that there's a tremendous treasure trove in the wisdom, experience, and life of our brothers and sisters who we would consider aged, the elderly. And so he really just makes us pause. And I really do appreciate the Holy Father doing this, and that he gives us a beautiful gift that Pope Leo now is continuing, to celebrate and adding his own little twist, if you will, to the conversation.
What did Pope Leo say about that? Because I hadn't been following that as closely.
So building on what Pope Francis talked about, so the culture itself, Pope Leo is looking at this and saying, not only do we have to recognize the beautiful treasure that our elderly bring, and particularly within families and in society in general, but also, what are we doing to foster this mindset of respect and that's owed to people, but also of contribution and participation. And this is something that Pope Leo really is saying. What are we doing in our parishes? What are we doing in the diocesan structure? How are we as individuals, changing the way that we approach? How do we pick up the phone, or how do we ring the doorbell? What are we doing to be able to interact with those around us? How do we react to people in general in society, who have reached a particular age, or so he's really just kind of diving deeper and saying, not only to talk about it, not only to mention it, not only to bring it to a yearly event, but how do we make that yearly event a daily event? And so he's building on what Pope Francis no doubt envisioned, by inaugurating this 5 years ago, and saying, how do we carry it down to its lowest levels? And then how from those levels does it move up? And how we create, even in the general population, our obligation, our responsibility toward our loved ones in family structures, but also our obligation toward our neighbor. And so living out the gospel. And that's where Pope Leo is kind of ringing that bell, that there's a gospel mandate here too. Love of our neighbor, and we shouldn't be so isolate. Because what Pope Leo talked about, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but he was concerned about what Pope Francis was really talking about. What are the consequences of a mindset that begins to diminish the contribution of a certain segment of society, right? And how does that create loneliness, abandonment? How does it promote, an unhealthiness within the society? So this is where Pope Leo is picking up that conversation and really kind of motivating the conversation to say, hey, there are consequences here.
Yeah, it's very utilitarian, and I also feel like it's a side effect of our throwaway culture, where it's like, okay, well, at the point of your life where you can maximally contribute to the good of society, that is when you are have the most worth.
If we take a utilitarian approach, we're looking at this from a quality of life. We're looking at it from a very, kind of an economic, point of view, which we should never do. In regard to human persons, it's the human person is a beauty and a value in themselves, because we're dealing with human persons. And so this is both what Pope Francis and what Pope Leo is, again, reminding the world. Especially, I guess we need to probably ask, well, how did we get to a point now where we have an aging population? So that's the real thing that's underneath all this. And all of this goes back to the whole consequences of a mindset that we would say flows out of the sexual revolution. And that is, it's interesting in that whether it be the UN, whether it be in my own column, I mentioned a comment from the Lancet or from an article from 25 years ago talking about, fertility and talking about birth rates. Well, here we are in this demographic winter where, because of self-inflicted wounds, our own choices of not welcoming children, purposely, not protecting human life, the advocacy for abortion and the murdering of our young. Well, it's brought us now to where, as the UN just says in that article I quote in my article, that, by the year, say 2080, that seems so far away. but yet it's not. That, instead of moving from, 1 in 6 being over the age of 65 to being 1 in 11 over 65.
Yeah.
These are substantial numbers. That means that we have an aging population.
Mm-hmm.
And so what is our response, to our brothers and sisters in that aging demographic?
When we've talked before about like the mushroom or like the inverted triangle, where it's like you have a lot of people of one, like who are elderly at the
Right.
top, and then not enough of a base to be able to support that and all of the challenges that poses. And obviously that narrow bottom comes from the fact that we have the contraceptive mindset. People aren't having children, they have been welcoming children, and you have multiple generations now where that's been happening. And so we're beginning to see the effects of that.
And with that, which again Pope Leo is acknowledging, which is what Pope Francis also acknowledged, which we have talked about, is that so we're not just looking at this from a gospel point of view, which would be very important from our perspective, but we know that there are physical realities within a society when we have an aging population.
Yeah.
And that is, so from just the point of view of from a tax benefit. So when you have a person working, they're contributing through their work, but they're also contributing through what they buy, what they spend, through their taxes. So if we have a decreasing number of people in the workforce, then the taxes that are generated from that in each given country, how they collect their taxes, which really supports the common good. And by that we mean infrastructure. So we think about our clean water, and how we handle our sewage and garbage. How do we deal with bridges and roads and all the various things that we all take for granted? This affects us all.
Yeah.
And so it's important, but it also affects the vulnerable even more, because the resources needed for their care can lead to a pressure of what we know today of euthanasia, assisted suicide, which, as I mentioned in the column, really flow from that contraceptive mentality. So we're back, to the reality that when we have that mentality that is generated, that at the beginning of life or being opposed to the life, how does that now affect toward the end of life when we're put in these kind of dilemmas?
Can you connect those dots for our listeners of how the contraceptive mindset, the anti-child mindset creates the euthanasia assisted suicide mindset?
Well, just basically what you said a while ago, Colleen, and that is, it's how we approach the human person.
Okay.
So if we have a mindset that already has a disregard and a disrespect toward the value of human life even at its very beginning, that mindset will move forward. And so that mindset now generates a control over life. It treats life as a thing to be used. It places a quality of life definition upon human life. And so when you think about all the various ways in which people approach the beginning of life and the reasons they give for not welcoming life and the very reasons why they advocate for abortion, then you see how abortion comes into existence.
I think you just said the point that I was kind of trying to get at is that it seems logical that an abortion mindset would lead to euthanasia, because if you're okay with killing before a child is born and you're not going to value human life at the end. I think what you just said about the reasons people give for not welcoming children is the answer about the contraceptive, because that isn't the same as I'm killing a child who already exists. It's I don't want to welcome children in the first place.
Right.
So yeah, it would just be that basically people don't see the value of human life at all because of the contraceptive mindset.
Yeah, what it does is it creates a cultural mindset. So this is what we're talking about. So it all flows from the same tree. So it's rooted in the same, evil, if you will, the same rot.
Yeah.
So as that tree, begins to reject the origin of life, the beginning and the creator of life.
Yeah.
Right. Then that mindset migrates. It moves. Right. And it moves into the mindset, well, we didn't want a child and the contraception failed.
Okay.
Now we have this dilemma. So how do we handle the dilemma? Well, abortion now comes, quote unquote, to the rescue. And then, so there's I guess we want to say there's an interior logic at work here.
Okay.
And so that logic, that kind of reasoning, I'm putting quotes around it because it's not really logical, but you can see the flow of it, and it moves through all the way through life, because I'm using life. Life is something to be used, and there's a benefit and a burden involved in this conversation. So if the benefit doesn't benefit me, then I can dispose of life. So as you move toward the end of life, that person is now perceived as a burden, perceived to be something that now deprives me of something. and becomes burdensome on my time, burdensome on my finance, burdensome on my obligations, my freedoms. And so the same mindset that you see in the very beginning
Mm-hmm.
grows and it deepens and it moves now toward the end of life. And we see people, begin to think of them as something that's depriving me of
Mm-hmm.
something. So it's easier to look at them from a utilitarian point of view, from a quality of life, and begin to say, you've outlived yourself, you've outlived your value. And so we move toward euthanasia and
And
assisted
you also
suicide.
see the same logic with abortion for things like fetal like disabilities and things like that, where it's like, oh, we don't
Mm-hmm.
want this child to suffer, or we don't want this child to grow up in another
Right.
example in this poor home or this poor environment. So then you see that
Correct.
same type of quote unquote logic transferred to the end of life where we don't want this person to suffer. There's no
That's correct.
like sense of life being worth
Right.
living.
Right. And also the service to life.
Mm-hmm.
See, there is a logic, an interior logic to the culture of life.
Mm-hmm.
And it begins with the respect that is owed to every human life from its natural beginning
Yeah.
till its natural end. And so that means that there is a logic flowing through how we approach human life.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts by welcoming life, serving life, being other oriented. What is my responsibility toward my neighbor, and how my neighbor, who is of value and of incomparable worth,
Mm-hmm.
and how do I approach that treasure? How do I approach this great gift, even with its challenges, even when there is a burdensomeness, and
Mm-hmm.
even when there is an obligation that's going to be costly to me in time and resource. But because we're dealing with something of intrinsic value, something of incomparable worth, then that's the starting point.
Yeah.
And it moves through the very beginning to its very natural end. This is what we began by talking about my grandparents and
Yeah.
great-grandparents. And so this is a value that was really passed on to us, that, and not obligation from kind of twisting your arm. You're a child. Of course, you're going to have your arm twisted a little bit, meaning that you have to be taught the value. You
Yeah.
have to see the value. And maybe sometimes you're selfish because you're thinking, well, I'd rather go do something outside and play games.
Mm-hmm.
Why do I have to be inside the house to help you with A or B? But by the parents and others, forwarding that value, upholding that value.
It does seem too, though, like growing up close by helps so much because you've hopefully, as a child, formed those bonds at a point where your grandparents can interact with you more, where you can have all those good memories. It's not just they're over there doing their thing, I'm over here doing my thing, and then only at the point when they need a lot more help do I move in. Like if you've built up those bonds of all the like quote like positive memories in a sense, then
Right.
it doesn't feel like as much of a burden because you're serving someone that you already have this deeper relationship with. So, and that's not something we can fix without totally changing the modern world, but it does seem like that's part of the reason that we have these challenges.
Which is why we're trying to transform the modern world's mindset, because what you're talking about is family.
Yeah.
You're talking about familial relationships, but that are also deeper and beyond blood.
Yeah.
It's beyond family, and since blood relationship, it's the same response I should have toward you, who's not a blood relationship. It's the same way I should hold toward the neighbor down the street. There is an obligation that is at play. Yes, the more familial connection there are, obviously those bonds are deeper and they run deep. But they are meant. This is something we were taught. The concern for others, to be mindful. And, oftentimes I've said this to my own spiritual director. I mean, I'm someone that's always mindful of other people. I'm a very attentive person. And just that something not only I was raised, but I know it's it's kind of an infused gift that God has given me. And so being very intuitive, being very sympathetic, but empathetic toward people, nothing really gets, to me more than when someone is being mistreated, and being unjustly treated, whether I'm in an airport, whether I'm in public forum. It really bothers my spirit. And it's because the concern for others and the value I see in others, and especially when they are very vulnerable. It really grabs hold to the point sometimes I really have to pull myself away, that I don't react. Because it bothers my spirit so much. And you have to, and that's all something that my family and my family, rooted in faith, rooted in the love of God, that taught us this value as well, upheld the value, I should say, and really, and helped me to fight against the temptation of pride, of selfishness that we all deal with every day.
Oh, yeah.
And so by naming a day in honor of grandparents and the elderly, you're really kind of pricking the conscience of the world
Mm-hmm.
and saying to the world, hey, remember. And, as I've said many times with some of the priests that I've had the joy of serving here with HLI, Monsignor Ignacio Barrero,
Mm-hmm.
Father Frank Papa of fond memory, both of them, I had the privilege of knowing. One lived a little older in life; the other died from cancer at a younger age, in a sense of in his 60s. But they both had such treasure of wisdom, experience, of knowledge, of people, of being priest. And all these. In the moment they pass from this world, those library doors closed.
Yeah.
I don't have access to them as I once did. And this is where the Day of the Grandparents and Day of the Elderly reminds us, among us are these
Mm-hmm.
great treasures. Among us are these beautiful people, as both Pope Francis and Pope Leo have been talking about, have something still to contribute.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is the value that we need to remind people of. And we miss these moments when other priorities begin to enter in.
It's easy to get busy and just forget.
It is so easy. And to know that not only is it in a sense of wisdom of this world, but it's also the wisdom of the faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I love how Pope Leo does something a little different, in his a letter on this. He actually talks about our ancestors of old. Moses in particular, who was in his 80s when God called him. And so the point here Pope Leo is raising is that he himself now is a 70-year-old man.
Mm-hmm.
To the world, from a business model would be saying, you're getting maybe past your prime, but there's still much that that Pope Leo can bring and will bring. There is much that many people of no matter let's just use the age 70 as the marker, all right? Just come up with an age, all right? That's so much more that a person has to offer and to give and to contribute, and especially when it comes to the faith, when it comes to not only having wisdom in their own faith experience, but helping others to live out their faith experience. And this is something why it's important to sit down and visit. I used to love in parish ministry, Colleen, visiting our homebound, who were, most cases, were just older people that became less mobile. And so could no longer come to Mass on a regular basis.
Yeah. Some
were dealing with illnesses. Some, were terminally ill, moving toward the latter part of their journey in life. I used to, love just being in their homes and sitting down with them over a cup of coffee and just listening to their stories. And many of them, was just so beautiful. I never knew as their pastor. I come to know them as pastors. So I didn't know them in their younger days. I didn't know them when they had young families. But by sitting with them and walking with them and accompanying them in that journey, I'm the one that benefited, tremendously benefited. Though they would tell me thank you for coming to see them, but it's for me to be so grateful for the privilege of knowing them. And this is what Pope Leo, following the example of Pope Francis, is now moving forward. And in moving the conversation, calling us in our parishes, calling us on our bishops, on our diocesan level, calling us in our work environments, in culture in general. How are we fostering a mindset of love, respect, and care?
What suggestions would you have for doing that?
So I just mentioned one. What's so beautiful is in parish ministry, as we care for those who've reached an age where their mobility has changed, or their things have happened in their lives where they no longer can be as active or interact with the parish family. How do we create structures that show inclusivity, that not isolation? We need to challenge that isolationism. We need to fight against it. And we need to fight against the temptation to kind of become absorbed in their own moment, which can be difficult because they're in transition. How do we accompany them in that transition? So this is where the parish structures of pastoral ministry come to bear. So Obviously, you have those that are being designated, either the pastors themselves or the deacons, or sometimes consecrated men and women, may be bringing Holy Communion, the
Mm-hmm.
sacrament of Holy Communion to the homebound. But there's another side of that. There's the visitation side,
Yeah.
that builds on bringing the sacraments. Visiting with them, sitting with them, talking with them. In one parish setting, this is what we created, so that I had a team that helped me in the home visitation, bringing our Holy Communion.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was another team that was created that was there to go pray with, to
Mm-hmm.
spend time with, to visit, have a cup of coffee, bring a little dessert and sit down with them,
Mm-hmm.
and build connections. The parish also, when we had parish functions, we always, especially when there was meals involved,
Mm-hmm.
we prepared meals for the homebound. We
Yeah.
brought them meals.
Oh, wow.
We
I love
made them
that.
feel part of the community. When some were still somewhat mobile,
Mm-hmm.
we would also create teams to go pick them up and bring them to special events. We would put special tables out, set them out in front of everybody, give them special attention,
Yeah.
maybe have balloons, flowers, whatever it was, to show them that they're still loved, they're
Mm-hmm.
cared for. You have to remember, we take for granted, my great-grandparents, all their siblings were gone.
Yeah.
So their generation of family that they grew up with, my grandfather, my dad's dad used to say, "I'm so alone."
Mm-hmm.
And yet here's a man that welcomed, almost, I think, 18 children, and I think 18 children, 16 that survived, and brought all these beautiful children. He's alone. Well, what he meant was my siblings,
Yeah.
my first cousins. He was the last in his family. My mother's dad would say sometimes the same thing. And they would say, "But Dad, wait a minute." But what he was talking about was what many people feel,
Mm-hmm.
and so how do we connect them?
Mm-hmm.
How do we intentionally seek them out and engage with them and not allow them to fall, which is so easy for anyone to do, to
Yeah.
fall into that loneliness, that isolation.
I think this is another place where I see the challenges of having such a mobile society because, like, for instance, I didn't grow up here. I don't actually know the people at the local parish who are homebound. Like, would you just, if you wanted to get involved in something like that, do you just go to the parish office and say, "I want to visit the homebound," and they give you a list of people? Like,
Right.
how does that work on a practical level for people who
Right.
don't even have like ties to the community and just moved there, even if
Right.
they've been there for like
Right.
10 years?
Well, it's all part of recognizing, that we're all called to proclaim the gospel.
Hmm.
We're all called into the vineyard of the Lord. And so the role of the parish is to help us to do that. And by creating whatever type of structures that foster that relationship. So
Hmm.
some people need a little more skill, but we all come from families. We all come from relationships, and we're all part of relationships.
Hmm.
So it's only natural, that it'd be easy to do. But sometimes people need accompaniment with that. So what we did was, we would have little moments at little workshops,
Hmm.
how to approach, because many times we also have to remember that some people just don't want to be visited. Some people like being alone. And so how do we engage that?
Yeah.
And at the same time, how do we respect it
Hmm.
without giving all the way to it? So a lot of times I was sent into those environments. So they would identify, and that's where I would go.
Hmm.
And it was rare that they would tell Father, "Don't come see me, don't come visit me." It periodically happened, but it doesn't mean I didn't still go.
Yeah.
So yes, I do think that is the way to go, is to find out what's happening in my parish. And if nothing is happening, how can I be part of something that can help the pastor
Hmm.
and help the local community? And to know that this is what Pope Leo is actually talking about. So he actually is calling for a revolution. He even uses the term, which I love it.
I wanted to get into that. But I also just want to, before we
Sure.
talk about his revolution of gratitude, because I was surprised by that phrase, what advice do you have for people who are listening who want to start something like that at their parish and don't necessarily know where to start?
Right. So I would say definitely, speak to your parish priest.
Okay.
Find out what can be of help, what's available, and also don't be judgmental if there's nothing there.
Hmm.
I'm very shocked if there would not be some outreach
Mhm.
in each parish. I've been in many parishes in my lifetime as a priest, and all of them have, to some degree, some outreach to those that are sick, dying, and the elderly.
Hmm.
And each one can grow and mature and become more, absolutely, but also contributing oneself. We've had people that, that volunteered, to go grocery shopping. We had people who volunteered, to go pick up medicines for them. There are many ways of contribution that really bespeak of the gospel alive. And we just need to be alive. We need to participate. And I wish more people, and I think most priests would be very grateful for the help, in being able to have outreach to the community, because you're going to know people, Colleen, as you said, even though you're not from Front Royal. I'm not from Front Royal, and my engagement in the community is limited because of this ministry, and I'm mostly away. But you live in the community. This is now where you reside for the last 3 years. So, but people normally are familiar with people on their street. Maybe not as much as when I was a younger boy. We all knew everyone, but the reality is most people are familiar with their next door neighbor, the neighbor next door, and they all hear, Miss So-and-so fell and broke her ankle. Can we cook a pot roast for her for next week?
Yeah.
People are wanting to give, and they hear. And sometimes the parish priest may not hear that. He might not see Miss Smith, for a couple of weeks and wonder what happened. And unless someone tells him, he may not be aware of it at all. And neither may the parish office. So I would say also building small communities within the community that really has, kind of like your neighborhood watch, very similar mindset, mindful of other people. So these are creative ways of doing this. And I used to love, the civil society often has things where they have, where the Council on the Aging, will pick them up and bring them to parish centers. And here by parish, I mean county centers. I'm from Louisiana, parish centers, the civil parish, where they have a recreation, they may have a quilting, they may have many things to engage our brothers and sisters who are in a certain age bracket to still be involved and still contributing. So we have to be creative.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what you're saying too, is you don't want people who are older only to have like companions who are older. Like it's important just for the sake of just bonds and for the sake of the youth to be able to interact with people who are older. And I was laughing earlier because you were talking about the people who don't want to be visited, and there is this very cheesy rom-com, and I do not remember its name, but it's about this like girl who does this like study abroad in Ireland, and as part of her study abroad, she has to go visit this nursing home, and she ends up being assigned to the woman who doesn't want anything to do with her. And it's just like this beautiful like sub story throughout this rom-com of her just like learning to engage with this woman and how much they both like benefit from the other person's companionship. And it was, I don't know, it was just it was immediately what came to mind, where it's like the benefits of those intergenerational relationships and how much they benefit both sides.
And that's a very good point, because our youth, the interaction between our young and our elderly is vital. Because you're also forming bonds, but you're also fostering a clear mindset, of service. I remember, in parish ministry, how we would adopt, particular nursing facility, and the school kids and those in the parochial programs in the parish, and would write Christmas cards or birthday cards, or actually gather and bring. Of course, in some cases, you can't give them sweets because some of them are dealing with diabetes, and so it's hard to know what to bring. But sometimes you could do that, and you would trust the nursing facility to be able to guide you. What can I give to Miss So-and-so and so forth? Sometimes it was, stuffed animals, but it's amazing the bonds that it creates, and also the memory of seeing someone so appreciative that you thought of them.
Yeah.
And this is what we have to foster and reconnect people. I think in parishes, the key also is for our priest and our parish leaders to foster this within the parish community as well, is call us out of the pews, if you will. When's the last time we visited our grandparents? When's the last time we visited an aunt or an uncle, or maybe a cousin that's now up in years? To really remind us to look at the kind of the plank in our own eye before we look at the splinter in the other's eye. What am I doing?
Well, that goes back to the family being the cell of society. It's like within the family that children learn to interact with their grandparents or great-grandparents. So then when they do meet someone else who's older, they have like a framework for that. They know how to interact, or they know what questions to ask, or they're just more comfortable with it. And if you have your children growing up isolated from the grandparents who live over here, and you don't have those stronger family ties, it's not that you can't overcome that. There's just more of a challenge in overcoming that.
Well, you're trying to create a culture, which I know from reading the letters of Pope Francis and now reading the first letter of Pope Leo, it is a culture.
Yeah.
They're trying to foster a culture within the culture that not only respects and gives the respect that is owed, but fosters a mindset of service, a mindset of protection, a mindset of love, which goes back to John Paul, really,
Well,
Evangelium Vitae.
And like the family is the place that culture starts as well,
That's
which
right.
totally fits in with this podcast.
Look within your first circle.
What did Pope Leo mean by a revolution of gratitude?
Yes.
That was like, I liked the phrase, and I think we need more gratitude in the world, but I was not 100% sure how that fit into this whole conversation. So,
well, we are the beneficiaries from those that come before us.
okay.
So if we just pause on that for a moment, just look at, for myself, a priest of 32 years, the priests that were my mentors, collaborators, colleagues in the sense of working together in the vineyard of the Lord. I benefited from the wisdom, the experience, the knowledge, the intellect, from so many people. I'm a better person because of those connections, and also being grateful for the challenges that came with it, grateful for the joys that came with it, but being grateful for the privilege of walking with other people and seeing the interrelationship between generations, and not a generational gap, but really a generational contribution to see each generation contributing to the other, fostering real flourishment, which is a language of the church, and recognizing that. And in a sense, but in a world today that has become so individualistic, so their approach is really, what do I benefit from it? And to really foster a revolution that becomes other-oriented, that becomes grateful for that individual sitting next to you, and not to discriminate because of age, size, but to recognize the beauty and the wonder of each and every person that's in your life, and the joy of opening yourself to the possibility of others to enter into your life. Society wants to mitigate people into the periphery. Once they have been designated arbitrarily of no longer value. So Pope Leo is literally saying it's time for a revolution of thought. It's time to recognize the beauty of each and every individual, especially those who are of an age that society wants to push to the side. We have to pull back into the circle and be grateful for the ability to serve that person, the gratitude of what that person still brings to me. And even a person here who may be disabled, may have cognitive disability, still has something to contribute.
Definitely.
Tremendous to contribute. And the contribution may be that they're giving me the privilege of serving them.
Yeah.
They're not doing anything physically for me. There's no financial gain, but the privilege and the gratitude being able to give to someone else love, friendship, and care. So he really is fostering this revolutionary thought that's pushing against a narrative in the world that promotes isolation, promotes this mindset of individualism. And he's pushing against it, and he's calling for a revolution against it.
Yeah, and I think that individualism is an important point, because one thing I was thinking of just throughout this whole conversation is how much our culture and our society has lost this idea of like intergenerational ties and like where you come from being important. Like, I mean, I'm a nerd about genealogy. I love looking into that. But like when you start looking into it, you start appreciating like the struggles that ancestors went through, where what their lives were like, and you realize you're part of this chain of people, and you start like recognizing your bonds to like the people around you, be that family or just people in your community, in a way that's a little bit harder when you're just in your mindset of like, it's just me going through life and trying to survive.
Right.
So I think that's an important thing.
And I love he even uses kind of being a protagonist. I mean, he's calling us to action. He's telling us to be a means of transformation.
Yeah.
He's not, no sidelines here. The Holy Father has called us out.
Yeah.
I mean, he's called us out, and he's called the world out on it. And again, because we're dealing with a demographic issue, that's the reality. But at the same time, this could be also a means to bring us back to another mindset, and that is the love of life.
Yeah.
And to begin to really pull back to family values that we have somehow forgotten and lost to memory, because of modern day problems and situations and dilemmas. How do we counteract that?
Mm-hmm.
This could be, again, a means to counteract that by being recognizing the need to challenge it.
Okay, so this next question is a little bit different than where I was planning on going originally, but I do want to address it. So I think a lot of our audience will understand the idea of like the obligation, for lack of a better word, that like younger generations owe older generations. That like obviously you don't want the elderly to be lonely. You should visit them, you talk to them. Like there's a sense of like duty to the people that came before you or the people that raised you, that you need to like be there and take care of them, and they're vulnerable and all of that. Do older generations have any sort of obligation to younger generations? Because I have seen not a lot, I've seen a handful of posts on X recently of people being concerned about the kind of retirement mindset where people will retire and they want to go do and enjoy life in their retirement. They don't want to be bothered with their grandkids, and they kind of just see this time after retirement as like, do as you please yourself. You've earned this because you've worked hard your whole life. And I don't want to say that people shouldn't do that in retirement, but like, is there any sense that people who are older, who are retired, like what should they be thinking about of how they can benefit the younger generations?
Absolutely. And I think we can very much, deduct from Pope Francis and Pope Leo's reflection on this, that those who have reached a particular age also have not only the much to give, but the obligation to give it. There is, so the idea is not only do they have a right to be respected, and I have a duty to respect it, but we can invert it, that they have a responsibility, to still be engaged and contributing and participating. So it's not because you reach a certain age that I can go sit over there and have my Mai Tai and everybody else kind of do what they want to do. Maybe there's a moment for that little relaxation, but we all are part of the human family. We're part of the human family, which means we all have an obligation and responsibility toward each other. And to see that the person still, no matter what their age is still a contributor to the good of others, still a contributor to the common good. And this is important for us. And so there really are, it's not just in a sense of my obligation toward the elderly and the sick within my family or not within my family, but also what is the obligation of those in those situations toward us? And so, yes, absolutely. It's a mutual exchange. Now, granted, yes, there are going to be some limitations. Yes, of course, there are going to be some things that others cannot physically do or be able to do. But, I used to remember telling, people in the parish, especially when I would hear the phrase, Father, I'm too old. I can't do this and I can't do that. Well, there may be lots of things you can't do, but there's still lots of things you can do. And so how can you join us with the things you can do? So we have to push against the mindset also that, there's, I'm old and I can't do this. No, there's still much. So yes, Colleen, it is a mutual exchange. But I know that the starting point that the Holy Fathers are doing, and what our Holy Father is doing, is he's also just pricking the conscience of the world that has turned itself, and arbitrarily segmented in a discriminatory way against a segment of our society, and it's not acceptable. Period. And he's also pricking everyone's conscience along that route. My responsibility, but he's also saying to those in that situation of life, having worked hard, labored hard, sacrificed much for their family, wanting to enjoy some of the things of life. Praise God, you have the ability. Be grateful for what you've accomplished. But what is your contribution back now? What can you be giving? I used to say this to some of those that retired, in the parishes from their jobs, and taking a little break. Perfectly fine. When you're ready, and hopefully it'll be within a year. What are you going to give back? You were a teacher for 30 years. Look at the kids and people you've impacted. I know that you don't want to go back into a classroom full time, but there are many things in our parish and within the community that would benefit from your wisdom and skills. There are people that still can't read. There are people that still need help with tutoring. Is there something you could do? There's so many ways. What Pope Leo has done now is he's elevated the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And if I may, I like to just read a couple of the quotes. He says that, speaking of what the elderly have to offer, go see your question here. Quote, "Our societies everywhere in the world are growing all too accustomed to letting this significant and enriching part of their life to be marginalized and forgotten." End quote. So yes, he's challenging, even though not just society, but he's challenging me as a member of society who might be in that situation of life.
Mm-hmm.
I've reached my 70 years of age. I don't have to do it anymore. He's saying, no. And he goes on, and he says, "Every parish, association, and ecclesial group," end quote. That's where we quoted, "become a protagonist in a revolution of gratitude and care to be brought about by regular visits to the elderly, the creation of networks of support and prayer for them, and with them, and the forging of relationships that can restore hope and dignity to those who feel forgotten." End quote. So this is it's a powerful reminder. And I'm so grateful that Pope Leo is picking it up and continuing what Pope Francis saw as such an important part, that the church plays in pricking the conscience of the world, but also with her wisdom. She's 2,000 years old, letting the church's wisdom guide us in our obligation toward each other. So it's a rich, rich moment that the Holy Father is giving us again this year.
Yeah.
And as we go through the year, the mindset now, hopefully by us talking about it, the Holy Father raising it, diocese is celebrating it, is what am I going to do in the year forward? And if we note, and not a comparing difference, but Pope Leo, by raising it now, what are you parishes doing? What is the local church doing? Now, Pope Francis mentioned all that, but now Pope Leo has just kind of turned up the heat and said, okay, we can no longer just speak wisdom.
Yeah.
How are we realizing that wisdom? What are we doing? So he's really called us to task in a loving way as a father and as a man himself, 70 years of age, who's still working. If I may use that, he's got a
Just
vocation.
got a new job.
But exactly, and I think that's a good point, Colleen. Because think of, as he mentions Moses, he mentions Sarah, he mentions many of the prophets. They were older men and women called into the vineyard, called to work, and you're thinking, 80 something years old. Wait, hold on. I just want to stay back and drink my coffee and have my tea and, do what I want to do, read a good book. No, Moses, I got work for you to do, go and set my people free, and that's what Pope Leo is raising. So it's got a humor side to it. But at the same time, it's a reality check that, there's still much for us to give. And as I say this, and I'm gonna, as I'm thinking in my mind, I was recently talking, and we all know that even within the church, our shepherds, the canon law of the church requires that when our shepherd, our bishop, reaches the age of 75, that he has to submit his letter of resignation to the Holy Father, who may or may not accept it, and so even the church herself has to rethink. And I'm not calling for a change of canon law, but what I'm saying is that, there's so much that our bishops who reach that age still have to give. The wisdom, the experience, their prayer lives, their example. So even maybe if they step out of, quote unquote, a leadership responsibility as the ordinary of the local church, and they have a successor, now as emeritus, what still do they bring? What can they offer? And they can. And some are very active. I have a bishop emeritus in my diocese who's 90 years old and working as hard today and in a more leisure way, which is a beautiful witness to the community. I admire him tremendously for this.
It seems like it's really just an accountability check that we don't impose a throwaway culture on ourselves, that we don't look at ourselves and say, well, I've reached a certain point, I have nothing more to offer, or that we don't look at our church and say, like, well, the bishop who's retired has nothing more to offer. That we as Catholics remember that everyone always has something to offer,
Right.
And that it may not be the same as what it was 40 years before, but that doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile.
That's right. And also just the mindset is how we change the structure of approach. but also how do we encourage those who are in that state of life to also see their responsibility to keep contributing.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a both and.
Yeah.
It's a both and. And I love, how Pope Leo has approached it.
Okay, so to wrap up the episode for today, I want you to give 3 calls of actions. A call of action to someone who's about my age, who is younger, what they can offer to people who are older in their community.
Right.
A call of action to someone who is more middle-aged, probably has children, but also is taking care of parents, like something that they can do to help their children be able to have a good dynamic with the elderly and be there. And then third, for someone who is older, who's elderly or retired, who is like what they can do for their community and for their younger people in their community.
So let's start with the middle group that you mentioned, because they're young parents. Maybe, kids are in their teenage years, could be, still young. But how to, within the family structure. So just like the church herself and her structures has to create a culture that fosters a mindset. That mindset creates a behavior. The behavior creates a pattern, and the pattern becomes an act. It becomes what we do. How do we create that within the family? So how do we encourage, as a parent, especially if I live away from my immediate family, how do we make those connections happen? So obviously we use technology. That's a way we can do this. The use of phones, Zoom calls, FaceTime, all the various ways in which we can connect. WhatsApp. I mean, I use this constantly around the world. So these are ways, but they're not as personal. They're still connections, but how do we personalize that? So what kind of structure can I create within the family where, as a mom and a dad, that we foster this connection, to our family members? How do we create those kind of structures? And maybe we need to really think about that and be creative. If we maybe we need to reevaluate, some of the priorities in our life, so that we take maybe a little more road trips. We go a little more often. We call a little more often. Even Pope Leo says, pick up the phone, don't be afraid to do this. And then and what that does is it starts backing it up, because not get to the first group you mentioned, because nothing happens in a vacuum. Children naturally can focus on their own little world like all of us can. So it has to be fostered. It has to be nurtured and created ways to do this. And so as you build a virtue in them, it becomes a part of them and creates those sensitivities. And so like my own parents, who I just spoke to my mother and my dad last night, and we were talking about their recent visit to see their great-grandchildren, and to hear their joy on the phone, and I can see their smile without seeing them, that they're overjoyed to be with their great-grandchildren. They're enjoying watching them grow up, watching their little behavior, their little behaviors, and watching their personalities develop, and you can hear the joy of that. And so how do we create an environment where that connections happen? And so that's important, because then the young people grow up in that. Their mind has got this mindset now that's now normalized in there, and also obligation. And I don't mean that from a rule, from a law.
Yeah.
I mean, it's moved from a heart of stone, quoting scripture, to a heart of flesh. It's been enfleshed, and that the child and young people see the importance of it. And the benefit they get from it too, not because grandma or grandpa pulls out a 20, pays for their gas to get in the car, but really interacts with them and sees the benefit of this. And so that's important. And then the other part is again, as we already mentioned, how do how are the generation of that again, remember I'm magic number 70. So how those of 70 and above, how do they contribute back to the conversation? So it really is everyone's responsibility. And I think for grandparents and parents and aunts and uncles, I remember when I was in seminary, I used to get letters, from my aunts and uncles. They my grandfather used to send me his chewed tobacco as a joke, So, but part of it was, again, the connection. And then at the end of his little note, I'm proud of you. These little things go a long way.
Yeah.
That you're part of a family. And then also the parishioners, and as I shared with before, learning from the parishioners about charity and kindness. So there's so many things at work here.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Father. That's a good just a reminder that everyone has this obligation and that we're all kind of part of this human family trying to look out for each other and that everyone has something good to bring.
Exactly. So
yeah.
I'm hoping people will go back and read the letter.
Yeah.
That maybe are not familiar with what Pope Leo actually said.
Mm-hmm.
And even though we have already celebrated the day,
yes.
it gives us a chance if we didn't celebrate it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we still got some time. Let's celebrate it.
Well, I think it's good to also remind people like why that day is important and like what it challenges us to. Because any day like that is a good reminder, but it's a reminder that comes with this challenge of like, what are you doing?
Exactly.
Mother's Day comes with a like, oh, let's celebrate mom. Oh shoot, I should probably do this all year round. Like this is just like that. There's it's a poke. It's a poke to say, hey, what can you do next?
And like in Valentine's Day, do it every day. You know, show love, show care, show support. Amen.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Father, for this conversation.
Well, thank you, Colleen. I hope it was very helpful.
I hope so, too. And to all of our audience, please like, subscribe. If you're listening on our audio platforms, please leave us a 5-star review. And as always, keep on living the culture of life. God bless.